So, hello, and thank you for joining the Chester County History Center to celebrate an incredible project that we had the opportunity to collaborate on. My name is Jennifer Green, and I'm the Director of Education for the Chester County History Center. So, before we get started, I'm just going to go over some upcoming programming, and then I will turn it over to Ellen Endslow to introduce the project and the participants. So our next virtual program will feature author Bruce Maude discussing his research on Chester County's great novelist Bayard Taylor. Bayard Taylor was a leading international travel writer, poet, literary critic, translator, and diplomat during the 19th century, and the author of over 62 travelogues, books of poetry, short stories, and novels. That will be on Tuesday, April 15th. 1 week later, on April 22nd, Earth Day, we will have a virtual presentation on Chester County forestry conservation pioneer Joseph Trimble Rothrock. And both of these presentations are pay as you wish, and I'll include a link in the chat box momentarily. So now that we've got everyone logged in, looks like we don't have any issues in the chat box. Jen says, I purchased a membership today, not an April Fool's joke. Thank you, Jen. That's very nice and supportive. From Percy. So welcome. If everyone else would like to put in the chat box where they're viewing from, I always love to see that. But if you have any questions during the course of the presentation, feel free to put those in the chat box, and either Ellen or one of our participants will be monitoring that. So feel free, as a question pops into your head, go ahead and put it in the chat box, and we'll try to answer it as soon as possible. All right, so now that we've got everyone logged in, I'd like to take this opportunity to turn the show over to Ellen Endslow, CCHC's Director of Collections and Curator, and she is going to tell you a little bit about this rather remarkable project.
Thanks so much, Jen. I really appreciate the introduction, and thank you all for tuning in from whatever location you are doing that. And it's such a pleasure to be able to talk about the Dr. Jan Fellowship with two women who were actual fellows at the Chester County History Center. I will introduce them in a second, but let me give you a little bit of background. The Dr. Mian Jan Fellowship was established by Dr. Jan, and I met him when he was a board member at the Chester County History Center. And to say that his biography could fill in the whole hour is an understatement, but I will abbreviate. He is a renowned cardiovascular disease specialist and has served as the president of the Westchester Cardiology. He's been in the medical practice for more than 40 years, and in addition to his many accomplishments in the medical community, for which he has received well-deserved recognition, Dr. Jan has also made a specific effort to promote community connections locally and abroad. In his native Pakistan, he supports foundations that fund women's education and widowed women's training programs aiming towards self-sufficiency. These are among other community projects that he has on the go at the same time. Locally, Dr. Jan is the 2024 recipient of the Westchester University Doctors Christopher and Susan Fiorentino Award for Diversity and Sustainability. Just one of his many local outreach initiatives is this Dr. Jan Fellowship that I introduced just a minute ago, and this is available at CCHC, and the funds are used for emerging professionals whose work expands our knowledge about people in Chester County who originate or are members of families that originated from South Asia. And so far, this work has expanded the CCHC oral history collection by way of recordings and still images. And it is this initiative that we're going to learn more about this evening. The presenters this evening are Charisse Octavio, who is the 2022 Dr. Jan Fellow, and she was an undergraduate student at Westchester University at the time she participated in this project. And her participation expanded the content to include not just South Asia, but also Southeast Asia in a meaningful way, and you'll hear more about that from her directly. Gianna Leonen was the 2024 Dr. John Fellow, who was just completed the fellowship in December, just before she graduated. She had a lot on her plate at one time, and she has a master's degree from Rowan University. She took the information that was collected by Charisse and turned it into publicly accessible digital exhibit. And that's all I'm going to say about both of them for now because they're going to speak for themselves. And welcome to both of you. So if you want to turn your microphones on, we will get the show on the road. Charisse, I'm going to start with you. And we had the really uh, I actually was not the person who was reviewing the applications in 2022. That was Kellen Baldridge, a former coworker who was the photo archivist at the time. And she was very impressed by the number of people and quality of applicants. And you stood out even among those really great applications. And I would love to know a little bit more, if you could share with the audience, what prompted your interest in applying to the fellowship in the first place? How did you see it? And what piqued your curiosity?
All right. Thank you for the warm introduction. Good evening, everyone. Once again, I'm Charisse Octavio. So I was introduced to the program by a professor. Around that time, I was doing an archaeological field school in the summer, and that same professor, Dr. Hooley, who's within the Westchester's anthropology department, she saw the fellowship as an ad, I think. And then she reached out to me and she said, I think this is a perfect fit for you. I know that you like talking about and representing your heritage. And history was something that I was considering on majoring in because I was only an anthropology major. I think this experience cemented the fact that, hey, I think I'm going to get another major in history as well. And so what really piqued my interest was the fact that it's oral history. This was my second experience handling oral histories. The first one was regarding I think it was on behalf of, oh, I don't remember her name, but it was on behalf of a professor and it was for a interviewing Muslim communities and Muslim staff members within Westchester during the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So hearing their stories out, and then I wanted to expand more on that by bringing on the challenge of doing it in another language because apparently English was not enough for me. And so um, as we unfold more into this project and or this fellowship, you'll see that I handled technically three languages. So I did my own language, my mother tongue, Tagalog, and then English, and then the mix of Taglish to communicate with different generations within my family. And so oral history has become one of my favorite mediums when recording and gathering information from multiple communities and connecting everybody through storytelling and um, through spoken recordings.
Sometimes when I've done a lot of oral history at Ford CCHC projects, exhibits, name the topic, and we probably reached out to, if it's it's more recent, we try to find firsthand experience, if you will, on the topic. And so I love to do oral history because I could listen to people's stories forever.
Right.
Um, did you have any trouble convincing your family that their stories would be interesting to others? Sometimes that's a barrier that I bump into, but I don't know if you did in your experience.
With my parents, they were actually more than happy to share. I think they like to talk about their experiences. So convincing them wasn't the hard part. I think they were a little hesitant because they didn't know whether they were allowed to express themselves in their native tongue. And so me being fluent in two languages helped them open up more. And from the recordings that Gianna had to filter through and listen to, I think we have plenty of content to say the least because they really like talking about how they grew up and the experiences that they had for at least for my parents. My sisters or my siblings on the other hand, because they were in their early high school ages or early high school or late middle school, they were a bit hesitant on sharing because they didn't, when I would ask them, oh, do you remember how was it like moving here? And they would say, I don't even remember moving here. And so that age gap really played a part to it. But other than that, I think a lot of them were willing and they were very happy to share their
And
experience.
you had to probably adjust to the experiences of the people, how you asked the questions and what you asked. Can you describe a little bit about um, sort of thinking on your feet in that regard?
Mhm. So in preparation for all of the interviews, I went a little bit more extra. I had one that was in English and then one that was in translated in Tagalog. So even though I'm fluent, the language that I would hear at home is different from the language that they would use in like more professional spaces. And so I had to translate them, even though again, once again, I'm fluent, just so that my parents could kind of understand what I'm coming from. There are some phrases that doesn't translate in my language. So for example, if I ask my mom, could you talk more about your childhood? And then she would ask, what do you mean childhood? Like which part of my childhood? Do you want like the grade school or the middle school or the high school? And then it was interesting to me because she was breaking it down by age. And then in America, like grade school isn't really quote unquote a thing. And so we had to translate that, oh, grade school is from this age to this age. And so from that point on, time and education and how those two closely linked together were already, I wouldn't say a barrier, but it was already a different perspective to go into. And so I had to be prepared on multiple fronts, to say the least.
And you not only interviewed family members, you also interviewed friends. And was there a difference in your approach to that?
Yes. Um, I had to do some background research on their countries and their communities' immigration stories. So I interviewed my best friend and her mother, who are both of Indian heritage, which would be completely different from a Filipino immigrant experience. And so I had to kind of look into, oh, what part of India were they from? Is there a difference between like northern Indian immigrants versus southern Indian immigrants? What pieces of history or historical context should I take into account? And so I try to keep it as broad as possible, but also keep it very, to keep those options there as well. So those time frames, but at the same time, following what they wanted to talk about. So it was so fascinating because I had to be so on my feet whenever I would interview them. Oh, they were going in this direction. Okay, I gotta chase that one. Oh, I remember you mentioned this. And so we would come back to it. So I just lots of note taking.
And I would imagine that you learned new things, but before we get into that, I'm going to reel in Gianna, if I might. And I would say too, actually, before I do that, Charisse, that you were kind enough to say right at the beginning of the fellowship, you asked us to do an oral history interview with you. And I have to say that you are the youngest person with whom I've done that. And the challenge in asking someone to look back in a much shorter time frame was a little bit of a challenge. And so I found myself learning and thinking, like you said, on my feet in order to find where the meaning of the story was going to go. How was this going to be relevant to talking about, in your case, the Filipino experience, a Filipino American experience in Chester County? What are the influences that have an impact, what some of the questions, I mean, we could actually talk about that for a second. We in that interview phase, we were talking about um, what are things that you cling to in a new place? What are the things that you're letting go? Did that come through in your other interviews in a way that you found typical, or was it unusual?
That's a very interesting question. That's a great question. I would say with the older generation, a lot of them were clinging into what they knew, whereas, which I guess is a little bit more expected, but a lot of them were bringing what they had with them and those experiences here. Whereas for the younger generations, such as me and my best friend, because we're more at that time, we were like very early 20s, and so we were looking at what our parents were bringing and how does that translate to our experiences here in a new country. And so how do we, well, I guess we talked about it more in these interviews, and maybe also Gianna would talk about it later when she's doing the common themes of it. But we were really exploring, well, how, for example, how does community now look like here in America, when the community that they are trying to bring here through like video chats and letters, how does that translate here? And we kind of act like as a mediator in trying to understand where our parents were coming from, at the same time as trying to understand what we're all getting ourselves into in this new country, for us at least.
Mhm. Very interesting. And so, Gianna, if I can switch gears to you, you were taking this, what I will call raw material. Oral history interviews are rarely um, like polished documentaries. Those things that we see on PBS or wherever are typically edited. They are, people cut out this and put in that and so forth to create a storyline that in many cases might be chronological, that could be some other organizational method. And so you are working, in essence, you're kind of the editor of all this raw material, the interviews, the photographs, the still images, and so forth. You jumped in with both feet, and I have to give you full credit because I really wasn't in a position to help you. I didn't create the raw material.
Yeah, so it was really interesting working with these interviews and transcripts and basically taking, like you said, the raw material and putting it into a digital exhibit. And when we had started working on it, it was just like, we knew we were going to use ArcGIS, and we had the transcripts and the audio files and all that kind of stuff. But we had kind of the beginning and the end, and it was just kind of trying to figure out how to get to the ending point, how to get to a digital exhibit and what we wanted that to look like and things like that. So at first, it was just kind of going through all of these, the audio files, the transcripts, and kind of looking for things that stood out to me, whether it was, little anecdotes like I had mentioned earlier when we were talking before we started here, or whether it was overarching themes that I eventually would make a page on, and kind of seeing what stood out. And then it was putting all that into ArcGIS, which was a really cool system to work with, especially the story maps portion of it, looking at Charisse's father's experience as an overseas Filipino worker, eventually coming to the US. It was really cool to be able to map that out and see visually, the the physical journey he went on from all these different geographical places. Um, and then also it was cool to, like I said, highlight those bigger themes, like culture and faith, identity, all these big topics that were talked about in the interviews, and putting them into something that the public could learn about. So it was really interesting to be a part of. And I liked that it was a digital humanities project because it was something I had never really worked with aside from assignments and classes and things like that. So with the field and like technology consistently being implemented more, I was excited to get to work on that, especially on a project that is so interesting and also so personal. It was really fun.
The themes that you mentioned, I can't remember, but I think that I don't remember that I actually gave you much help on what the themes should be. I think they materialized from the
Yeah.
raw material.
Yeah, I think like I said, it was just kind of stuff that stood out and that I noticed like across the 5 interviews, that were common stories or common themes that came up that I felt like spoke to the experiences of all 5, but also just like not only the overall experience of South Asian and Southeast Asian immigrants in Chester County, but again, like the personal aspect of it, like Charisse and her family and her best friend's family.
And so you turn them into, you have the overview that we have
Mhm.
published first, and then We also have the two families, and I'm going to take a minute here to click on the visit the, I don't know if this is going to work with the screen share. Oh, it is. So this is what you can find this on the CCHC website by logging into My CCHC, going to the Exhibits tab, and in that drop-down menu, you will see Digital Exhibits, and that's where you can find this work. And this is the initial exhibit. And I remember talking with you about uh, some of the ins and outs of ArcGIS, and we have a colleague over at the Chester County Archives where they use it extensively. And but then you were on your own, Gianna.
That I was.
Um, I would agree with you that this turned out to be an excellent platform for this particular project because of geography.
Mm.
For anybody who's listening who's not familiar with ArcGIS, it's typically used by people who are working more typically, I would say, in geography or in engineering or in, whatever you would be doing that has location as a primary focus. And little do we necessarily realize that we can really do a lot in history. To me, the value of ArcGIS in this situation really relates to the way we try to reach people. For example, in what I will call a standard physical exhibit, one of the things that people have given us feedback year in and year out is if you're doing an exhibit, give me a timeline and a location. People want to know when things happen and they want to know where things happen. And I think that this particular platform, not perfect by any means, but it has a really nice professional layout. And if you scroll, well, not in this example, we'll get to that one in a second, but here you can see culture and family activities. It looks like, Charisse, you all have a lot of fun. Looks like family get-togethers are a big deal.
Yeah, we try. It's one of our quote unquote love languages is to spend time with each other.
And that comes out in this story. And I think that the value of working on a project like this oral history with people who are sharing something firsthand is an enriching opportunity as we go through time. And 50 years from now, people looking back will have a slice of the life or the experience that they would not ordinarily have had. I also like the fact that we have the audio components, and that was great. Now, Gianna, did you clip the audio components out of the existing interviews using ArcGIS, or did you use another software in order to create them?
So I used iMovie. I downloaded the audio files to my computer and just imported it into iMovie. And when I had when I had gone through the transcripts, and also when I made the indexes for the interviews where there weren't transcripts, you can see like the time, like the point
Mhm.
in the interview when they talk about certain things. So then I would just like go to that time, and then just clip it. And then it was really easy to import it into ArcGIS because it's just you save it as an MP3 or MP4 and then just upload it right on there. But I also liked including that because I feel like I can only write so much about the different experiences and the different stories, but I think it definitely is impactful to hear it, because also when I was listening to it too, it was impactful to listen to. So like I know I experienced it in a way listening to it where I felt like it was impactful. So I wanted to include that here as well instead of just writing it to read.
And you get to hear the person's voice.
Mm-hmm.
You get to hear something of the personality of the person, and it also aids in different learning methods. Some people learn well by reading, and others are by visual imagery, and others by hearing. And I think that this is a really great opportunity. Food, we got to talk food. I mean, really, this is fantastic. And did it make you hungry working on this, Gianna?
Yes, it did. I don't eat pork, but the only time I will eat pork is if we get lumpia, and that's the only time I'll eat pork because I have like I can't not have lumpia. So it did make me hungry.
So how much, Charisse, how much did food figure into the conversations of the interviews? And did people um, glom onto that subject, or were they, how much did they embrace that topic, I guess?
Um, I don't remember food being as one of like the biggest topic of conversation in across all five of them. I think very few, there's mentions of them, but I think a lot of them kind of talked about experiences that included food in it. So for example, as Gianna listed out here, in Mrs. Pallavi Chavan's case, she was talking about how food became a source of support as well during when she was talking about motherhood and pregnancy, and how giving food and presenting food was how that kind of was customary for them. So it wasn't about the food, it wasn't a conversation about the food and what types of food that we ate, but it was more on, well, how does the food aid to the story, and how does that how does that show community? Because as we clearly see here, making meals, for example, was a gratitude of or an action of support for them during like difficult times such as like pregnancy. And so food kind of revolved around that. I wish I could talk more about what types of food they kind of ate, but it really didn't really come up.
It's interesting that food, I'm going to veer off a little bit to our Many Nations project several years ago. And food became a topic in oral history conversations. And one individual um, from Poland talked about the fact that when she went to school, she came to the United States as a young person. And because her family was Polish, they ate Polish food. And when she would go to school, she said, I had a school lunch that was Polish food, unlike anything my American classmates had. And she said it didn't just have garlic, it was like a whole garlic aura. And so, and interestingly, a woman in Phoenixville who came from India was giving her own children, she'd been here for a number of years, and giving her own children um, uh, lunches made of Indian food that she knew how to make. And the kids wanted to fit in to the American classroom, so-called American classroom. And they said, we want a peanut butter and jelly sandwich on white bread. And she looked at them and said, well, how do I do that? And food became an identity kind of assimilation piece of that puzzle. And it's an interesting story that people can tell related to food. And I think that talking about that and taking turns helping somebody who's in need or who needs the help with food is a really important part of that story. Faith. How did you come up with faith as a theme, Gianna? That's a really big one.
Yeah, I feel like when I was reading the interviews or listening to the interviews, specifically with the Travan family, they talked a lot about faith, and I guess in a less traditional sense, like in a less like structured sense. Like I had written here that there wasn't a specific uh, religion. There was like some beliefs that aligned with Buddhism, but there were some Hindu traditions as well. And I thought that was really important to include because I think, a lot of times when we think about faith, we have religions in specific boxes. And so it was refreshing to kind of see that someone's faith and someone's beliefs and um, things like that could be a spectrum and could be different things and different experiences. And so I really enjoyed putting that in here. And there was one quote that I think I included in here. Yeah, anywhere can be a temple, really. And I thought that was also um, an interesting way of looking at things because, like I said, I feel like, again, when we think about religion, it can be very structured. Um, but I think when it comes to like spirituality and reflection in that kind of sense, as Prutha said, like anywhere can be a temple and you can have that kind of experience wherever and like any degree of it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I think this is immensely fascinating, and I personally like that exploration to see how people find meaning through faith or non-faith in their life. And here we see this variety that I think is so interesting and uh, sort of well, there's a fulfilling aspect of it in order to help people make sense of the world around them, I think. And I had no idea that there was a thing with Filipino Christmas. This is a great video.
Yeah, I remember Charisse talking about it in her interview about how it was like from September on, it's all Christmas, which I think is funny because I feel like that's a big debate in the US of like, do you put your Christmas tree up before Thanksgiving or after Thanksgiving? But then in the Philippines, it's like way before Thanksgiving.
Mhm.
Make the most out of the holiday season.
I think, Charisse, you called them the months.
Yes, the Burr months. So starting from September, October, November, December, even seeping into January, those are all Christmas seasons. So you would start hearing Mariah Carey by September, which might be annoying to some people, but you know that it's Christmas season, for at least for us. And the lights, you see a star in this banner right here. We call them parols. So besides Christmas lights, parol, and having those stars and those star lanterns, basically, they kind of signify that, hey, Christmas is here, even though it's a bit early, but it's here.
But you just elaborated on something that we did Season of Lights this past in 2024 on the holiday season, and we wanted to celebrate winter beliefs, celebrations of holidays and things. And someone from the Filipino community from Phoenixville put up this very nice, I think they are Catholic as well, and put up a tree with various ornaments that reflected sort of a Filipino artisanship, and then asked if they could hang this really large star-like lantern on the wall. I'm like, they said, "What? We don't want to, sort of flaunt the rules here, but this is really Filipino." And so you have just confirmed that.
Yes.
And challenges, pressures faced by children of immigrants. That's a big topic, and I think that you're both insightful people. And from the firsthand experience, Charisse, how did you find yourself balancing between the two, between a couple of worlds and different generations?
It was a journey, and I think I hit like a breaking point in college. And I actually, I call it personally as like the great intervention, because I don't usually go heart to heart with my mom in the same way that maybe, like, for example, in American films where they like sit down with their children like, I love you, my daughter. No. In a typical quote unquote Asian family, I love yous are kind of hard to get by. They say I love you through action. um per se, like preparing food for you, or preparing fruit or slicing apples, something like that. And so having an intervention where my mom had to tell me, you don't really have to put all of these pressure for yourself, right? And then at that point, it kind of clicked to me that, oh, so this is just me doing it. And so that was very reassuring. And I think that's a lot of the pressure that other immigrant children face, is that when their parents move here, at least for first generation immigrants, I'm not too sure about other like second generation or one and a half immigrants. I'm not too sure how they would go about it. But a lot of us are like, our parents sacrificed so much to get here. And my mentality has always been, well, I got to make the most out of it. And so every opportunity that I could get, I would kind of go for, and I would stretch myself thin. And it was my mom saying, you could enjoy your life. We just want the best for you. And, you know, like any other parent, they just wanted a better future for their children. And sometimes I kind of forget that that is the path that we're kind of on, which is just to improve ourselves and to improve the lives of our future generations, and not to kind of focus on the negatives and the sacrifices, and kind of see the better pictures of that.
Mhm. Did you pick up on that, Gianna, when you were listening to the various interviews?
Yeah, I think especially like I have here the conversation of Therese with her best friend. I feel like that also came out quite a bit because obviously they both shared that experience, but I think you could also tell like the friendship there, like you guys were comfortable um, confiding in each other with that experience. But I feel like identity was something I definitely wanted to highlight. Um, Not only in just like coming to the US and the idea of assimilation and like holding on to certain parts of your culture and things like that. But just like Therese talked about the in her interview, the like conflicting identities and things like that was something that I definitely related to in a different way. My parents aren't immigrants, but I am half Filipino and half Italian, so having like both of those identities was is something that like is can be hard to navigate because I feel like a lot of times it's hard to think about the fact that you don't fit into a particular box. And I know Therese talked about that in terms of being whether you're Filipino or Filipino American and kind of straddling that line. So I feel like identity is a theme that not only came through in these interviews, but like I said, like I personally related to. Um, and I feel like the discussion that was had about identity and certain expectations and things like that was something that was impactful. And I think that anyone can relate to, whether it's in the same exact way as Therese or whether in a way that's more similar to myself or just in general. Um, so yeah, I felt like that was something that really stood out to me that I wanted to include in this exhibit.
Well, I think it encapsulates um, the whole the challenge of change and cultural combination and what does it mean when we say assimilate and does that have an impact and do you want to assimilate? You know, for various people it means different things or has to a different degree and retaining culture or identifying home, all of that is really a part of what that identity is about and what do we use to identify ourselves. And I think that's a tremendously fascinating topic that I think a lot of people spend a great deal of time talking about or thinking about. And I'm really glad that you brought that out as one of these themes. And of course, we can't talk about, human beings are messy and discrimination on identity is a part of what that's all about. And that's another interesting theme. But in this case, it seemed that it was also about gender too, and not just, you know, place of origin. So, Charisse, did any of this surprise you when you were interviewing your parents, or had you heard some of these stories before?
I've heard some of the stories before, but it kind of puts my mother in a different light when she was talking about mainly doing so well in male-dominated fields. So as she mentioned, she was in the quote-unquote STEM fields because she was in the engineering field, and she joined what was like the ROTC of the Philippines, which was called CAT, the CAT. And so it was it was incredible to see that part of herself where she's like, well, I'm they choose me because I'm good and I'm competent. Whereas I feel like other people would focus on the fact that like, oh, we have these discrepancies maybe in gender, maybe in age, maybe in in race or identity. But she was very much, well, I know that I'm competent and I'm confident in myself and I'm confident in my abilities. So that put and I was like, wow, I should have this perspective for myself. So it was incredible on how she tackles the world and how other people also have that mentality instead of kind of focusing on what the world has set up to be against you. She focused on what her strengths were. And she said, you know what? I could do it, and so can you. And so she empowered me in that way.
I think that's wonderful. And it's nice to have that sort of captured too. And Gianna, again, I did not suggest themes, but you picked up on this in terms of what you were able to combine in this overview.
Yeah, I feel like it was definitely important to include not only the positive experiences of certain cultural elements for the community, but also talk about the challenges and like Charisse talked about the pressure she felt or um, difficulties with identity and discrimination. I feel like is definitely a part of the experience, and so I felt like it was again something important to include. And even like you just talked about, not only discrimination based on race but also gender. And I feel like intersectionality is so important, and I feel like that's something that people are talking about more now, as people are becoming more aware of, again, the different identities and the different boxes and things like that. So I think it was important to include not only the experiences uh, as a Filipino, but also as a woman. And so I feel like that was something that came up when I was thinking about important things to include, not only the positive, but the challenges as well.
Mhm. Very definitely. And there's a picture of Charisse in 2014. Do you look at that and think, oh my goodness, I was so young then?
I think about, oh my goodness, why did I let this come out?
It's wonderful. Don't worry about it. But I think that Prutha Siobhan sums it up. Keep your culture alive because it's so important, and we don't want to lose that in this country. You don't want to lose who you are in sort of like a big old mix. And so I think that that's an interesting point of view. And I'm going to go now to back here. And here are the individual exhibits that, or the pages, if you will, that were created too. And so do you want to say a little bit about how you organized this particular family story, Gianna, when you were developing the digital exhibit?
Yeah, so when I was going through the transcripts and the audio files, like I said, I was taking note of important themes or important stories. But for the Travans, especially since I was creating an oral history index, which isn't as in depth as a transcript, it's kind of like a general summary. It kind of made writing the page a little bit easier because I had like the biographical points in my mind, if that makes sense. Um, so I had written, again, basically kind of like a biography of each of these women. And then if you scroll down a little bit, I have the story map for Pahlavi, which again was something really cool with ArcGIS, is that you can show the geographical journey between all these different places. So I definitely wanted to include that as well. So yeah, I wanted to, like I said, a general overview and then the map, because I definitely focused more on the themes, the overarching themes in the page that we had just looked at.
I could play with this map.
There's so many different kinds you can make too. So like I would like plug in the coordinates and I'm like, what does it look like on this setting? What does it look like on this setting? Um, but yeah, it's ArcGIS is super cool.
That's really nice. And and what I think is so great too here is we have a photograph of multiple people. That's what it's all about when it comes right down to it. And this graduation photograph kind of says it all. Um, yeah. And then I'm going to go back to the Octavio family. Sorry, we're putting you on the spot, Charisse.
That's okay.
But there you are, and it's a wonderful photograph. And um, again, how did you, um, Gianna, how did you take all of that rich material and distill it? That is a challenge to take hours and hours of narrative and turn it into something that really excites the interest of somebody who may know nothing about the people, the culture, or whatever. And you have done it in such an engaging and succinct manner that I think it really makes this information accessible.
Thanks. Yeah, again, I just kind of wanted to give a general biography about the three family members that had such fantastic oral histories. And then we have Teresa's dad, Esmeraldo, the journey that he took, not only, immigrating from the Philippines to the US, but as an overseas Filipino worker or OFW going to Peru and Saudi Arabia and things like that. I think that his journey lent itself very well to this feature where you can see all the different places he went before eventually ending up in Chester County. And the pictures are really, really cute as well. But yeah, it was really cool to kind of put that stuff together. I didn't find it to be overwhelming, even though there was like a lot of stories and there was a lot of material to go through. I think just like I said, just kind of taking notes while I was listening to it or reading it. Um, Eventually, I was like, okay, now I have pages and pages of notes. Time to find a common thread or find out where all this connects. Um, but yeah, I really enjoyed being able to put it into something like this.
And we won't go through quite so much detail with this one because we will let the viewers and the listeners go to the website and find out for themselves. Because I'm realizing that we're having so much fun that there's a lot to say. But one of the nifty things that you did, Gianna, that was of your own initiative was asking, well, there were two things that both of you did, besides the good work in general and your amazing work ethic, both of you. It's been just such a pleasure working with you on this project. And Charisse, you said initially when you were doing the interviews, you were asking about who, it would be acceptable to talk with, and we were all for it when you had personal connections. And then you said, does it have to be in English? We said, no, if you know how to translate, go for it, because we would be delighted to have it in any language, but we need help because we don't know Tagalog. And so that's not something that we're going to be able to easily translate. So you put in a lot of work on the translation as well as the transcriptions and so forth, in addition to the interviews. So that was a remarkable asset. But then I would also say, Gianna, the thing that, besides distilling this down to a manageable sort of what I'll call a bite-sized chunk, was to be able to say, would you like an educational guide? And I'm saying, are you kidding me? Would love to have an educational guide. And so this is like a bonus round as far as I'm concerned. And can you talk a little bit about what motivated your suggestion to do that and how you developed it?
Yeah, so when I was doing this fellowship, like you had mentioned earlier, I was in my last semester of grad school and I was putting together something similar. I was doing a digital exhibit through Google Sites instead of ArcGIS. And I wanted to include, I was also required to include some educational component for my final capstone project. And so when I was working on that and creating that digital exhibit, that website, and I had to create an educational guide, I figured it would also be useful for this as well. Because while I think you can learn a lot just reading the website and going through the website and looking at the pictures and listening to the audio clips and things like that, I think it's helpful to kind of have a specific overview and then also just kind of general discussion points, because so many topics were discussed, so many stories were told, and I feel like it's nice to kind of have a little guide of like how to break down those different conversations. So yeah, I wanted to include that. I felt like it was useful. And like with museum exhibits, like in-person museum exhibits, I know the museum I work at, they always make gallery guides and educational guides, and they're always wonderful, especially for school groups or the public that's just kind of seeing this stuff. So I wanted to include that as well. Not only discussion points, but also I made a list of like further reading or further sources that kind of relate to the project that I feel like would benefit anyone who was like, this is really cool. I want to learn more about this or something related to it.
Well, I think this is a tremendous asset to help pinpoint, just like you've described. And when I saw it for the first time, I thought, bingo, this is a great thing that we can take this whole digital exhibit and education guide and make it available to teachers in Chester County or wherever people can
Yeah.
access it. And as such, you are both sort of, um, I'm not sure if pioneer is the right word, but you are both um, leading lights, if I may say so, in terms of helping people understand something about community. And I think that that is the whole intent of what the Dr. John Fellowship is about. And Gianna, Charisse, I started by asking you what attracted you to the fellowship. Gianna, I didn't give you a chance to say anything about that, so it would be a nice bookend if you would describe a little bit about what attracted your attention to the fellowship and what brought you to this possibility.
Yeah, so I was in grad school I was in entering my last year, my last semester actually, in my master's in Holocaust and Genocide education. And so I've always been interested in history. I did my undergrad in history and education as well. But more recently, I've become more interested in public history and learning through museums and cultural sites and things like that. Um, and so when I was, looking for stuff, looking for ways to get more involved, and I was Googling museum jobs like every other day. Um, I came across this, and like I said, I was excited that it was a digital humanities project because not only was I getting experience in public history, but in the technology side of things. And like I said, that has become much more prevalent in the field. And so I was very excited to be a part of that. And the fact that it also was highlighting experiences of the South Asian community and Southeast Asian community was also something that I was really excited to be a part of.
So there we have it in a nutshell, an amazing learning opportunity that these two young people have really, I think, embraced in meaningful ways that have really embodied what I think Dr. John is trying to do in the community. And I think that the work you have done is exemplary, and we appreciate it very much. Um, is there anything that we talked about or that you've considered before we hit the record button this evening that you would like to add to the conversation? And while you're thinking about that, I would also like to say to anyone who's attending that we would be glad for any kind of comments or questions, and we have something here in the chat box. If you have any questions, um, I don't know if you can read this, so I will read it out loud. And this is from an attendee named Elizabeth, and she asks Charisse, if you could do another oral history with anyone, who are some of the people you would want to interview?
That is a great question, Elizabeth. And the people I would want to interview is kind of a little deeper on the darker subject. My grandmother passed in December of 2024, and my grandfather passed recently, February of 2025. And so if there were two people that I should have interviewed, it really would have been them. And I visited the Philippines 2 years ago. At that time, I was also working with another oral history project. And I remember thinking, oh, I should have gotten one of those recording devices that I used back in CCHC, just to record with my grandmother, especially because my grandmother at that time, she was losing her vision. So the only thing that she could really rely on was oral and audio.
Audio, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so that would have been a great opportunity. But now there's other ways to commemorate and celebrate her and my grandfather as well. But if there were two people, it 100% would have been them. And hearing their stories on how the Philippines was like, for example, with my grandmother, she was more on the urban side of the Philippines. My grandfather was more on the rural and mountain side. And so their dialect would have played into part how they lived their life differently, what types of industries they were in at the ages of like early ages of 15 going into adulthood, which would be like more like mid 20s for them back then. So uh, I just wish that I had done so, but now now we move forward and commemorate them in other ways.
And Gianna, there's a question for you here. What is something that you learned from this project that you'll carry forward in your professional life?
That's a good question. I think with this was my first time working with oral histories, and I wasn't the one conducting them. Obviously, Charisse did that amazing job. But I think just like looking at the personal side of history, I feel like a lot of times um, in the study of history, it's very like broad overview. And I think listening to these oral histories and even just in general, like reading memoirs and things like that, really highlight the very personal aspect of history as well. It's not only a collective experience, but it's an individual one as well. And I feel like being able to hear these stories, and like I had mentioned before we started with the public here, just like the little anecdotes and things like that really highlight the personality and the like I said, just like deeply personal experiences of everybody. So I think definitely when looking at history and like different people in it, or contemporary history that's happening before our eyes, just kind of understanding the individual behind it.
Very good. And there's James is another person who has submitted a question, and he says, "This is incredible work." And I have a question for Charisse. When you were conducting your oral histories, did any interviewees switch back and forth between English and your native language? And was that a challenge for you either during the interview or when you were transcribing them?
Yes. Sometimes I think what happened with both of my parents, they would start off in English because they kind of think, oh, this is an interview. Every interview in the US is formal. I have to speak in English. And so they would start off in English. And then as they got more comfortable, they would start talking in Tagalog and more to the kind of the colloquial side of that. So I would have to translate that, and then I would realize I can't translate this because there's no word for this in English. And so I would have to put like little anecdotes below and say, okay, so imagine it like this, or so the vibe is such and such. So that was really fun to explore, but at the same time, there are some of them that I wish translated in English as well. But I think it was by describing it as more like this is the aura or the attitude of this entire phrase. By describing it that way, I think it comes across better instead of translating it hard on, um, meaning that it's
Literal.
translated as literally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I could continue to be chatting with you and asking more questions, but it's going on 8 o'clock. And out of respect for everyone's time, I'll go back to my initial comment bit here at the end, and that is, did either one of you um, want to add anything that you had been considering before this conversation started, and as you were preparing for it, that you have not had a chance to share with anybody? And that's always such a broad question that nobody ever really knows how to answer. But
I don't think I have anything that I haven't shared, but just like in general, Charisse, it was great getting to meet you well, virtually. I met you virtually before, but especially when I was going through all these interviews and things like that, like you said, it was cool seeing your family in a digital exhibit, and on the other side of things, it was cool to get to work with you and put something together based on the amazing oral histories you conducted. So it was great.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I was actually going to say something in a similar light. I was going to say, you put so much work into creating that exhibit. I know it was not easy sifting through those interviews because they were 2 hours long, and there were five of them. So that's like 10 hours of work. And then finding common threads among them, making the ArcGIS part of it, making it into a digital and also a visual exhibit, having like educational opportunities with it. I'm astounded and just highly impressed of your work. And thank you for representing me and my family, my friends, and my family's friends in such an incredible light. You've done tremendous work and tremendous lovely work. So thank you, Gianna.
That's so meaningful. Thank you.
And thank you both. You have done justice to the Dr. John Fellowship, and I hope that other students can reach the high bar that you both have set. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you for giving us this opportunity.
And with that, we are signing off. And if anybody would like to learn more about programs that we have upcoming at CCHC, if you missed Jen's introduction, you can see that on the CCHC website. And Jen, do you have any closing remarks?
Just as always, thank everyone for joining us for this virtual programming. We could not continue on with our mission and what we do without all of you who tune in and support us in every way. So thank you all so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.